Happy Thursday and welcome back to the Wolff Den presented by Win Again Academy. I'm Matt Wolff, founder and CEO of Ticket Time Machine. Today we have Mike Merrill on the show. Welcome to the Wolff Den, Mike. How's everything going?
Things are going great. Thanks.
Good to have you here. A real interesting story that I'm excited to hear more about, as I haven't dove into it too in depth, knowing that you were coming on to talk about it. But for those in the audience who don't know who you are and never heard of you, give a quick introduction and then we'll get into it.
So I like to introduce myself by saying I'm the world's first publicly traded person, which no one needs to know what that means because it's also something that I invented. So it's essentially I sell shares of myself and then I let my shareholders vote on my life decisions. So I have this stock price that changes all the time. It kind of based on if people want more or less influence. And then when I have a big personal decision to make, I put it up for a vote and just kind of let the crowd decide.
And how long have you been doing this?
I started in 2008, so it's been going for quite a while.
It's a long time. A lot of votes and a lot of decisions. Tell us why did you do this and how did you come up with the idea?
Yeah, I've always been someone who spends a lot of time just on the internet with friends, and back then I was working on a lot of these different projects. There was a lot of kind of blogs and podcasts and things like that happening. And I ended up helping a lot of my less technical friends kind of figure a lot of that stuff out. And among that and doing all these other projects, I was like, I need an umbrella to kind of hold all of these various projects together. And so I kind of just decided, this form of shareholder capitalism worked really well. People could come in and leave whenever they wanted. It would create this pool of money to be spent on, hosting fees or new projects or whatever. So it kind of started out with this very, let's do a lot of kind of weird stuff online. And then it slowly shifted into more and more control of my personal life.
Well, what's your background that you got into and had the technical knowledge to do this?
I'm not a developer, but I'm lucky enough to be friends with many developers. So, but I don't know, I've always been in and around computers and online. I mean, growing up, even through the 80s, my dad always had a computer around. So we were, it was just something I was very comfortable with. And I think, the internet kind of happened when I was in high school. And, even I remember a friend of mine showing me the kind of first version of the web and me being like kind of scoffing at it, being like, that's not going to take off, not when we have all these other things go for an FTP and whatever other protocols we were using. And yeah, so I think I've just been kind of steeped in it for a long time. And that and kind of like looking at how, especially with the early kind of wave of the web in the late 90s and 2000s, like business kind of took over. And so it's kind of this playing around with this idea of capitalism a little bit and how it interacts with the internet and online communities.
And what was the reaction that you got when you first did it and the process of starting this?
Initially, I mean, when I started, it was really like, I think if you go back to some of those first votes, there's like 12 people on there. It was all kind of my immediate circle of friends. It wasn't very many people. And I think I was enough of a weirdo at the time that people kind of accepted it as like, oh, this is just a thing that Mike's going to do. That makes sense. As it went on and more people found it outside of kind of my immediate circle, it sort of dawned on me how strange and weird this thing was. And then I kind of, and even now I it's hard to remember how strange it is because I've been doing it for so long, but it's yeah, it's a pretty dumb idea in a lot of ways.
What?
I'll admit to that.
Yeah, it's definitely strange. Unique, I think, is unique is a word I would use for it also, which is it's a cool, unique, strange. I mean, those are all words you could use to describe what's going on here. But obviously, you found something that interested people outside of that you didn't even know who want to come in and take a part in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of it a lot as this kind of beacon that I put out that attracts like-minded people. Like if I saw this project online, I'd buy shares, And so I think anyone who buys a share, there's probably some element of connection that I'm going to have with that person. Last year, or this year, I guess, I went across the country and actually met a lot of my shareholders for the first time. I was driving across the country. If you're around any of these places, I'll come and meet for a drink or a coffee. And that was super fun. It wasn't even, like I went in kind of with no agenda and just kind of chatted with people. And that theory was right. Like most of these people, I'm like, I like hanging out with them. So.
What was the goal when you first did? Obviously, it was just something you wanted to do, but did you have any type of goal when you first did it? And where are you at, now with it? Moving
Yeah,
forward?
I don't think it's ever had a specific goal. I think to a large extent, like I grew up, I was in the army briefly, and then when I got out, I moved to Portland, Oregon, and I was around a lot of writers and artists and musicians, and I felt like I didn't really have a kind of I wasn't creative in the same ways as those people that I kind of wanted to like be around. So I think this was my version of kind of creating something like that. It's like I can be kind of as experimental or strange and explore these new ideas through the internet and capitalism as they explore through writing, music, or some kind of art practice. So I think it was an attempt to kind of align myself more with sort of the weirdos I was surrounded by.
And financially speaking, is it something that you thought ever could turn into something? What is a shareholder, you know, what is their mindset when they're buying a share and they're spending money on this?
Yeah, I like to be real upfront and tell people, this is even though it's been going on for a long time, and I'm super dedicated to it. It's still an experiment, and it's changing all the time. So, with that warning, it's I've relied on it at certain times in my life as my primary form of income, but I normally don't. I normally have a day job, or I freelance and do things like that. So the money that's kind of pooled together through the selling of shares is kind of like the collective group of shareholders helps decide how that's going to get spent. So for the most part, that's sort of a collective decision. Um,
What's the share is at around $6 now?
yeah, it's in between. I think it's like in between 650 and 7 right now. Yeah, it hovers for the longest time between like 4 and 5, and something in the last couple months we kind of broke through that barrier, and so now we're above $6, which is pretty nice.
Do you have an understanding of what moves that?
If it moves a lot, it's usually it's a pretty low volume market, so one person can come in and make like a pretty big impact. Usually, it's if there's a big press or something like that that draws a lot of people in, that'll bump that price. That's usually typical. Drops are a little harder to figure out. Sometimes people just want to liquidate their shares, and sell out. Sometimes, like I'll reach out to them and I'll try to ask and I won't get an answer. But yeah, I think it's mostly media has been kind of the big increases. This last one, I don't know. I think through the pandemic, I've been a lot more active and kind of relying on that shareholder community a lot more, which is how we met was kind of roughly through that through shareholder extended shareholders kind of like introducing us, and I've met a lot of people, and I think that's kind of brought people in a little bit more. So I think it's been kind of a gradual increase through the pandemic.
What are your main modes of outreach when you're reaching out to community, whether to engage with them or to maybe find new people who might be interested?
I try to be everywhere, but I'm most active. Just I have a mailing list for most people, so if you sign up, I'll kind of put you on the main list. There's like 1 to 3 major emails a month, kind of either vote announcements or just kind of like what's going on. But it's mostly just like a mailing list seems to be the easiest way. I know some people prefer text or other updates, and I have all the social media accounts. Mostly, I'm on Twitter. I'm not. I don't know. I'm not super social media active. I probably should be. It probably would help up the share price. But yeah, the I don't know. I like the kind of more direct connections with people, and it feels like you get that a little bit more. Even if you broadcast an email, people can respond privately, not publicly. And so I think you get to engage with people a little bit more that way.
Yeah, that's more about building the community, which is good, right, inside. But also, I do think social media probably would increase the amount of people who buy shares because it's not a lot of money to invest, and
Yeah.
something that's pretty cool to just be like, hey, let me see where this takes me. Interesting why someone would want to liquidate their stuff because the money is already in there, right? It's already spent. It's not like you have
Right.
to spend any money to to maintain it. So unless they have like, and I assume most people don't have a huge amount, so it's not like it's going to be some big windfall. Like, hey, I could pay my bills.
So years ago, in like I think it was 2000, I think it was 2013. I went on the Today Show because of this project, which was like insane. And the spike, you can look back at my stock price and you see this massive peak right there. And I think it went all the way up to $20 a share for a second before it kind of like leveled back out because there's such a massive influx of people. My older brother actually sold. He was like an early buyer at like, $1, $2, $3 a share as it was going up. So he sold enough shares to buy a dishwasher for his house because he was remodeling his kitchen. So I like that because whenever I go over to his house, I'm like, oh, that's kind of the Mike Merrill Memorial dishwasher that he bought with my shares. But yeah, that was a time when people were liquidating just because the price went up really high. And you'll see that sometimes, less a liquidation and more, it's almost like a price increase, right? Because if someone's buying, someone's selling, right? So yeah, but it's pretty rare that someone just decides to fully dump their shares, and then, yeah, also I'm kind of fine with it. Like that's part of the idea of having this active living market is you kind of have to take the ups and the downs.
Yeah. Now you sold. How did this start? You sold X amount of shares for X amount of dollars.
So there wasn't enough demand when I first started to kind of do like a traditional IPO. So it was really more like, I don't know, I guess equivalent to like a direct listing. The market was created. I held all the shares. I just started selling them kind of bit by bit and let people buy them. Um, as the shareholder community grew, because I had so many shares, I could kind of undercut the price at any time. And that wasn't really fair for people. So now all the shares traded are just between the shareholders, and then I'll do maybe an auction of new shares that I have maybe like once a year. And so it's kind of like a slow and steady dilution, but kind of they know it's coming. It's not gonna screw anybody up.
So if you want to buy, you're buying from someone, not buying stuff that's there and available.
Exactly. If you go and look at the market, it's all the offers are from, the other people like that are looking to buy and sell. Oh, and then another aspect that I have is I can grant people shares. So the friend of mine that works, a shareholder that works on the site, and we've developed new features. I pay him in shares. So he'll usually he'll invoice me, we'll convert it to shares, and then he'll usually list a bunch right away. So it's less of a liquidation and more of a way to get more shares out into the market.
Yeah, I own a few shares. I won in the poker game that I met you through. I haven't logged in. I don't even know if I have a username yet, but I got to figure out how to do that so I can get a little bit more involved. You talked about the Today Show. That's obviously a huge publicity for what you're doing. You've also had some other articles written, and recently went out of the country to do a TED Talk.
Yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the press is funny because it's I don't go after it, but it feels like it's not quite steady, but it's always like somebody kind of stumbles across it and tells a friend or something, and somebody reaches out and wants to talk about it because I think again it is a pretty like strange and weird thing to do, to kind of give up that much control to these other people. So every year there's probably, I don't know, 3 to 5 different kind of either podcasts or maybe an online article or sometimes even a magazine kind of piece. And it's always super fun because it's like I said, I'm so used to it that I kind of don't get to go into like all of the different aspects of it. It's fun to talk to somebody about it and kind of like dig into whatever their specific angle is on it. And then yeah, in October, um, I went to Vienna and did a TEDx talk, which was incredibly terrifying and super fun. Because like that's a stage. I've talked about this before, but generally in like pretty small groups and pretty small events, and that's a stage that when you're standing on that little red circle, it's super intimidating because like we've all seen TED talks, we know how big and important they're supposed to be, and so I was like, man, I do not know what my like big takeaway idea from this is. So that was a hard challenge.
What is a takeaway? I mean, I'm excited to see the TED Talk. I got a little pre
Mhm.
before, but what's a takeaway when someone hears your story? What do you want them to know and feel?
I I think for me, like I came up with this slogan at some point, community through capitalism. It's plastered on the front page of the site, and I kind of forgot about it for a long time. And as I was really going through the origin of where does this idea come from and why does it matter to me, I think it is much more on that community side than it is on the capitalism side. Like I I think of this as a way to sort of play with a lot of these economic ideas and to play with capitalism and to kind of understand it by doing it. I feel like I learn best when I'm really hands on. So I've learned a lot about markets because we had to build one this way. But the real value of this has been kind of like the amazing people that I've got to meet and interact with. Not just like one off either. Like I've created ongoing relationships this way, and like some of these people have, like referred me to jobs or found me a place to live, or it's like it's a real network of friends in a lot of way. And then some of them I still don't know and are still total strangers. Like of my top 10 shareholders, there's probably 4 or 5 that I, wouldn't recognize on the street if I walked by them, kind of thing. So and they've invested, into hundreds of shares of mine. So there's kind of this always this idea of these people that I'm like, oh, I can't wait to meet, you know, Rugger or Adam Kessler or some of these names that are like just usernames to me, and then have come in for so long. But yeah, that I think it comes from. I grew up in Alaska. I grew up pretty alone out in the woods, and so I think this is a way for me to kind of connect to a lot of people and have that kind of constant connection. Um, and people care about my weird random things that I'm doing because they're invested, which is pretty ego satisfying for me and hopefully fun for them.
What was growing up in Alaska like?
Oh man, it was again, as a kid you don't know how weird your upbringing is because it's the only experience you have. But I recently, as part of that road trip, I picked up my parents now live in Florida, and I picked up these. I have them over here. These like 5 or 6 crates of stuff of all the time they were in Alaska, and I've been slowly going through it and seeing like what that was like through their eyes as like young, basically young adults, younger than I am now, growing up there. But we were in this place called Coldfoot, Alaska, which is above the Arctic Circle. It's like I think there's 10 people that live there. It's like a little truck stop, and yeah, like I think I knew more moose than I knew people, growing up. It was just, yeah, it was wild. Like during the day, if it was daylight out, it meant it was summertime. It was daylight all the time. And then in the winter, like the sun never came up past the mountains. It would just, the sky would lighten a little bit and get dark again. So yes, it's pretty wild. I'm sure that has shaped me in ways that I don't fully understand. Hopefully for the positive.
What brings someone to live there?
I mean, for my parents, it was they were building the pipeline in the I think that was like mid to late 70s, and my dad was a truck driver, so he was helping that process, and then he became a state trooper, fish and wildlife, and so I actually have all of his old trooper logs I've been going through, and it's there's so many like found a moose carcass, saw some moose. It's so much moose stuff in there. It's insane. But that was like, it's a lot of hunting and fishing kind of enforcement that he did up there because he'd always been like super outdoorsy and loves the outdoors. And yeah, so that's what brought them there. And I was born in Fairbanks, and then we moved up there when I was, I don't know how old, like first grade or something like that. So yeah, it was like again, like my formative years, I think were very just like it was just like my immediate family and then a giant expanse of tundra and mountains.
When did you get to the U.S.? Not the
Uh,
U.S.
yeah, we moved to kind of a more like suburbs, Alaskan suburbs when I was in 5th grade, and then I left Alaska when I was 17 and joined the army. Did that for a couple of years, and then Portland, Oregon. So.
Does it feel, I made that mistake, but does it feel like it's another country as
Uh,
you're far away and kind of,
Yeah, way more so when I was a kid. Like I remember flying somewhere in high school, down to the lower 48, as we called it, and someone saying, oh, do you live in igloos? Like there was no concept of Alaska, or the classic thing was people would think that Alaska was down by Mexico because on the map it's always in that inset down at the bottom or something like that. I think now with there's so much like reality TV with ice road truckers and all that kind of stuff. I think people have a kind of a better understanding of it. But yeah, I think for a while it was a very like kind of mysterious and strange place. And honestly, it still is. It's just like we see it more. We're a little more used to it.
Yeah, I want to go back to the comment you made about the community and some of these people that you would walk past on the street and not see them. I actually experienced that in my life on Facebook, where I'd be like sitting in a row behind someone at an event or and they don't have any idea who I am, which is it feels kind of weird. I don't know. I don't know everyone that's in my network, but I kind of, if you're in my network, I kind of want to know you. I think
Yeah.
at least understand, like to be like, if I was in the same room with you, like, yeah, we should probably chat and say hi, how you doing?
Yep. Totally.
But it speaks to people just accumulating connections. Um,
Yeah.
it's kind of like I experience that a little bit on LinkedIn now with what I'm trying to do with my business because I got to connect with a lot of people.
Yep.
But community is big right now. I mean, that's what people are trying to build, the communities, and then try and figure out, I guess maybe how do you monetize that, or how do you enhance that?
Yeah. I think like I have a lot of friends that are like musicians and things, some are more successful than others, and I've seen them get approached by fans, and that's a super interesting thing to see how people react to that, because obviously I think at up until a certain point you're so kind of like in awe of that happening, and like my good friends that are in a band are always like super appreciative and spend a ton of time with people when they come up because they really value that. But then you see it, you know, the more frequently that happens and the more famous you get, the more you have to kind of like put blocks in place kind of thing. So I experienced the smallest version of that. Like when I send out an email, I mean there's only like I think there's like 3,000 people on the total list, and which is not a huge mailing list by any means. But because what I write ends up being pretty personal, it'll kind of inspire a lot of personal responses. And then I really feel like, oh, I need to give each one of these the time and attention. So every time I send out one of those big emails, there's usually like 4 or 5 conversations that starts that takes a while to kind of like, settle down a little bit. So I feel like those are kind of always happening in the background. And that's a little bit of part of that community management. And it's not like it's enjoyable and it's fun, but it is work too, right? Like you're really trying to like give something back to these people that cared enough to write.
Yeah, I respond to everything I get, and it's not to compare it to in the way that you're responding as conversation, but I think there's something about responding to people and trying to increase that connection and make it a relationship, and maybe you'll find out it's not a good fit, right? And
Right, right.
failures off because you're not going to be friends with every single person that buys a share or that reaches out to you. It's just no one has the time for that, and it's not likely by the percentages that's going to happen.
Yeah, and you kind of have you end up kind of creating shortcuts that way too. Like I have a little guide that I put together. So if someone has a really super brief like how does this work? I don't feel a need to like handwrite a big response. I can just be like, "Oh, here's something I put together." But if someone writes a real kind of more personal level engagement, then I kind of want to respond with that same energy. So I do think there's a lot of little tricks you can do that way. Or, we have a Slack channel for a bunch of the shareholders, so I can just kind of invite people over there, which is pretty fun. On the poker game where we met, we also have that kind of live chat aspect. It's kind of fun when a new person comes in because everybody else will kind of chime in and answer the questions, and talk about like how things work and how the share price works. And it's kind of fun to watch how other people sort of interpret this project.
How many people really understand what's going on when you talk to them initially?
Initially, I think more now. I think because of the rise of cryptocurrency and that world, there's a lot more understanding that economics and finance is something we can play with and kind of mess with. And a lot of people kind of assume it's a crypto project right away. But it probably would be if it had started later. I was just like before the first like Bitcoin block was mined. I think it was like a year apart, but it was basically at the same time. Like I kind of the idea of this thing of being a publicly traded person kind of came to me and was being thought about at the same time that the sort of like early cryptocurrency stuff was happening. So I think in the same way that those conversations were really difficult early on and are getting easier, I think it has been for me as well. I've been able to kind of ride that trend. But yeah, sometimes it's the thing people really get hung up on is oftentimes less the financial part and more the decision making. Like how how could you possibly let other people make decisions for you? And that kind of gets into sort of the philosophy side of this whole project.
Well, what are some of we haven't gotten into any of the decisions part of it. What are some of the decisions that people have made, and some silly ones, some important ones? Give us a little taste.
Yeah, so recently I've been doing kind of these kind of just more for fun votes every month. I'll try to do a challenge, and the shareholders will decide what to take on. So, like last month, I tried to reach out to a new person every day of the month, and I failed because that's very hard. Because again, I would start these conversations, and then I'd be like, "Oh no, I didn't reach out to a new person. That was yesterday's person." Um, and so I have these little kind of fun monthly challenges. But then there's been some really big decisions as well. Like the first big personal decision I put up was. Um, I was it's like right when I started this project, 2008 and 2009 maybe, and I was considering getting a vasectomy, and I really wasn't sure which way to go. I had some friends that had done it. Was talking to them, was talking to my friends, was talking to my girlfriend at the time, and eventually just decided I'm going to let the shareholders decide because I want a decision to be made. I want the kind of like the clarity of knowing what to do. And they all voted that it ran for like a week and then it came out like no. So I was like, great. Now I won't do it and I don't have to think about it anymore. And that was kind of the first kind of twist into this more personal decision making. And then from there, they've helped me find a job and determine where I should live. There was a whole long period where they controlled my romantic life, which was kind of part of the rise of a lot of the press attention that I got. Um, and yeah, and then just kind of smaller projects and ideas that I want to play with. I'll usually kind of like get the buy-in of the shareholders before doing those.
So, speaking of romantic life, you're married now, right?
No, I have a girlfriend that I live with, but we're
Okay,
not married. Yeah.
not married. But so, what are the people in your life think about this over the years? Because it's sort of like it reminds me of the Howard Stern. Remember the movie with his wife got all upset about him putting stuff out there. What type of reaction do you get from the people you've been romantic with?
With when I first started this project, I was dating someone, and I think that was a difficult adjustment. A lot of that, she was interviewed for the Wired article that came out years ago, and she did not love the portrayal they had of her, and so that was difficult. That was a hard thing. Um, since then, everyone I've dated has obviously known about it beforehand. So my current girlfriend has just decided to opt out and not buy shares and just not participate in that aspect. She still will engage and talk to shareholders, and she's kind of a character in the K Mike EM universe, but she's not a shareholder and she's not participating at that level. Um, my dad's a shareholder. My two brothers are shareholders. My mom refuses to buy shares. She says that you shouldn't judge a person's input based on how much money they've spent, which is probably true. My mom's probably right there, but that's the experiment that I'm taking on. So, yeah, it's interesting when people are really really adamantly against it. Like I'm not offended or bothered by that. I think it's interesting. I think like I said, this is not something that I'm like I think the world should do and I think would make things better. This is a experiment in how to apply these kind of economic theories to a very personal decision making.
Would you like to see it mimicked?
I think now it's going to be. There's been a couple kind of again in the crypto space. There's been a couple things that are pretty close. No one's done it kind of as consistently as I've done it, but we're seeing these kind of groups come together, like DAOs and things like that, that are sort of collective decision making. And so it'll be interesting to see kind of the evolution of it that way. I wouldn't be surprised to see more of it. I think most people have a hard time surrendering what they want to do to another group of people. And I've been lucky in that I started with a small group of people I knew and that knew me, and it's kind of grown pretty slowly and carefully over time. So I have a lot of trust in my shareholders. If I didn't, that I think that idea would be a lot scarier.
But there are a lot of people that you don't know.
Yeah, but they're like most of the people own a small amount of shares, and so and I get to choose what goes up for vote. That's an important distinction as well. I don't just let anyone say, a question people often ask is like, what if they voted for you to kill yourself? And it's like, well, unless I decide that I want to do that, like that's not going to go up for a vote. And so that's kind of part of the control that I maintain is I get to decide what gets voted on.
What is the K for? I don't know if
Oh,
I
just my first name. Mikey has always been the name I used online since I don't know since I think I was in high school. I go by my middle name, which is Mike, and so it's Kenneth Michael Merrill. So I've always been K Mikey M. It's arguably the worst URL of all time. I have mike-merrill.com, which is kind of a overview of a lot of stuff, but the trading happens at kmikey.m.com, and it's a terrible URL. But again, it was a different era back in 2008. I wasn't thinking with my marketing brain.
Then we have the information scrolling at the bottom for anyone who's interested. But it's all consistent, like the Twitter and Instagram and the website KMike. So there's something of value for that.
No, that's true, and it is pretty easy to get whatever on any new service. No one's out there trying to get KMikeEM. So that the fact that it's unique across everywhere. In fact, I tell people sometimes just Google KMikeEM, and that's me. You'll find me wherever you want to interact. So I think having a unique kind of handle, is pretty useful.
What comes up when I Googled you to try and find something, a website or some information to put on here, and I found that there's an actor, Mike Merrill, and I think, but in the images when I Google Mike Merrill, I think there's one picture of you shows up in a sea of pictures of him.
So years and years ago, there was this guy in Texas named Mike Merrill, and he was like, I think he did a lot of like SEO stuff. So he and I always battled in the rankings for Mike Merrill. And then he got a job with like Salesforce or something and kind of stopped promoting himself as much because he wasn't a freelancer. So then I was like the number one, the dominant Mike Merrill. And now this actor who comes out of Atlanta and has done a bunch of, and I've watched his career basically from the Google rankings, and he's risen up and risen up and risen up. And he recently got on like a NBC show or something, I think. And he's like super handsome and ripped. And I'm just like, how do I compete with that? So yeah, that's a hard one.
They also don't look anything alike. He's a
no, that's true.
Young black man.
Yeah, he's a very handsome, well-built black man, and just, I'm just like, man, again, like I think he looks better on the image search results than I do. So I got to I either have to hit the gym a lot more if I'm going to compete, or get some more press. But no, it's interesting to see that happen. And I've joked around. I've had this idea in the back of my head about I, I have this project where I want to like sell someone, maybe him, my name, because it's like if we're going to be like competing for it, then it has value. And as a person who's loves capitalism, I should just sell it to him. I'll give up my rights to it and take a different name. But I emailed like his manager something years and years ago and didn't get a response. But maybe now that he's more famous, I should try again.
Yeah, or that maybe you might have more clout than you did back when you were.
Yeah, that's true.
I have there's a Matthew Wolff who's a famous golfer now, who's
Oh,
rising up the rankings. So I've reached out to him. I'd love to talk to him. There's not a ton of Matthew Wolffs with the name spelled the same way.
right.
So you would think, I don't know, if someone reached out to me with the same name, I would respond to them. I guess I understand, people get famous, but still, it'd be it's interesting the way there's people who get confused all the time online, especially online and social
Yep.
media for, if you at the wrong person because you think that's who it is. I mean, we've all done it before, and that person just gets blown up. Uh,
Yeah, the a friend of mine has what's his oh man, I can't remember. It's like the same Twitter handle as like a world leader somewhere, and so keeps getting added as if he's this and he's a tech person. And so it's like it's a very like that idea that people are like kind of messaging you, especially on something like Twitter all the time about that is it's very funny to me. A friend of mine, she has the handle the universe on Twitter, and so people will message things to the universe
that's
just thinking of it as a phrase, and then she sees those, which is pretty funny.
that's pretty cool. Yeah, Matt Gates, the politician, has someone. I think it's like Matt Getz and on
Mm,
Twitter, and he just gets. I mean, he's getting roasted daily on this thing.
that's
And we're like,
hilarious.
what are you going to do? I don't know. He's changed.
Every Yeah, every year I do this shareholder conference, and I have people come in and do like a short talk. And I had this idea that for 2022, I might try to just collect Mike Merrills. Like if it was just like 5 or 6 different Mike Merrills, each giving a talk about whatever they're experts at, I think would be a really funny and interesting idea.
Yeah, I think it's having the same name is it's interesting because there's nothing that ties anyone together.
Yeah.
It's just a name, and I guess maybe you believe some Matthews or Matts act, in a similar way. I don't know. It'd be
Yeah, there's a phrase, nominative determinism is a phrase where it's like what your name is somehow has some effect on who you are, which I'm sure psychologically at some level it does, like as you learn that stuff. But I think it's interesting that we didn't, you don't choose it. You like essentially strangers chose your name, your parents. They don't, they didn't know what kind of person you were going to be. So you kind of you're given this label, this name that you're going to carry along, and that's the thing of like changing my name that I've thought about is like, well, if you actually could be really active about it, then how do you make that decision? Naming is one of the hardest things, naming a business, naming a kid, naming yourself. I feel like those are like, it's almost easier to build a product in software or something like that, or a business than it is to name it.
yeah, names are tricky. But you could go by your first name if you gave up Mike
Yeah,
Merrill.
yeah, that's true. Yeah. And that I guess that's the one connection a lot of us have is obviously there's family ties to it. Like, my first name is the same as my dad's first name, Kenneth. So there is some connect even though I don't use that name, there is some connection there.
Yeah, so my friend Brent, his father's name is Brent Meckler also, and so it's a lot of perks with having sometimes having the
Oh,
name as your.
yeah. When my dad was flying a bunch for work, I used to be able to use his Alaska Airlines perks and like go to the Alaska Airlines lounges and stuff like that. It was the best. And then he retired, and I was like, there's the one great perk of being Kenneth Merrill.
There's yeah, Brent's father is a very good blackjack player, and so he gets a lot of stuff in Vegas and
Oh, that's hilarious.
with gambling, even down here at the Hard Rock. So yeah, it's a pretty good thing to have. Um, the people who have bought shares, is there anyone well known, famous?
Not that I know of. There's been a couple people that I've been fans of, like artists and musicians and things like that. But I don't think anyone, as far as I know, I've never noticed anyone of like real fame buy, or if they have, they've done it, under a pseudonym, and I don't know who they are. So yeah, none that I know of. I think trying to think through some of my more like proud shareholders I'm proud of. Yeah, no one jumps to mind.
Who owns the most?
It's a person I've never met actually. This guy goes by Douglas Dollars, and he I met him. Well, I mean, he found me when he was like investing in a lot of things online, but kind of in a playful way. He was doing a lot of like Kickstarters and things. He was from Canada, and I was a pretty small part of his portfolio. And then over the years, I kind of watched and have chatted with him online and have gotten to know him virtually. But he got a job at Google, and then started kind of kept up buying shares, and just sort of recently he broke the 1,000 shares mark for the. I think he's the first shareholder to ever buy more than 1,000 shares. So he's the top of the leaderboard right now.
That's a pretty good number, and they're worth about $6 a piece. So
Yeah.
that's
Yep.
that's a nice chunk of change.
Yeah, it is. He's up there. And then right below that is my friend who I pay in shares, and so he's been gifted a lot. But then in third place is probably my oldest friend Josh Berzin, who I've known since high school. And he's also been kind of slowly accumulating over time. He's got a huge stake. So yeah, it's whenever I'm like writing up a new vote, I'm definitely aware of who the big shareholders are, and it gets like pretty political. Like I'm kind of like being like, oh, I need to include these things for Josh. I need to put these things in for Gene, And so I'm kind of like thinking through the what I know about those people and what kind of questions they might ask.
What would make this thing go nuts and blow up? What?
There's a vote coming up. I had a couple shareholders put together a proposal to move it to the blockchain. And so like right now I run the entire market myself, and that's great in some ways, but maybe I do think it limits it in the sense that everything exists on this one kind of web page. And so there's this idea of what if all these shares were actually tokens traded. I think that if that happens, I think that could potentially blow it up. I think that'd be I think it would expose the idea to a lot more people. I think I'd have a lot more shares sold. Basically, like right now, I think there's about just over 15,000 shares being held by shareholders. And so the idea would be like, could I sell all 100,000 of them to a bunch of people? That'd be huge. I think I don't know how the response of the TED Talk will be, but I'm excited to see that and see if that has an impact. Because I mean, doing that, like getting on stage, I feel like I kind of went into a fugue state. I don't know how good it's going to be, but it was pretty that's something that can have a big effect and could potentially draw a lot of people in. Um, I think, but yeah, the idea that some big thing happens, or it hits the right pre-established community that a lot of people kind of come in and buy shares, would probably be the thing that would really take it to the next level.
And what would be the end of this whole
Man,
experiment?
yeah, I think about that a lot. Obviously, like if I die, it's over, or at least it's over for me. I guess the shares could still be traded, but I like to think that it needs to end in the spirit that it started. So some kind of financial, a scenario. So I don't know if that's a hostile takeover, or if there's some version of me going bankrupt or through chapter 11, like how do corporations die? Maybe they get acquired. So I have to find some analogy that works for how a company would end. But there's still a lot of things I want to kind of play around with. So I'm in no rush to end it.
Yeah, it's very time consuming though.
It is. I probably put, an hour plus a day into it actively, and then probably more than that, sort of subconsciously thinking about it. So, yeah, it's definitely a pretty incorporated part of my life. Probably as much as anyone thinks about their own business, I probably think about this, which is a lot.
Yeah, I mean, aside from financially, it's you want to see whatever you're doing succeed, and it's yours, something you created, which is pretty. It's very impressive, I think, and probably not very easy to maintain. Even if an hour a day doesn't sound like a lot until you're doing an hour a day.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly. Yeah. And that's at its most passive, right? Like there's also times when I'm working on a vote, it's a lot more than that, there'll be times when it's like a full day's work of just writing this stuff up, responding to people when the vote's up, and kind of promoting the vote over all the different channels. So it can definitely um, move up from that point for sure. But it's yeah, I would say minimum hour a day.
And when you're not doing it, you're in advertising, you're consulting.
Yeah, I kind of came up in tech and then worked at an ad agency that specialized in tech companies for a couple years here in LA, and left a couple years ago and have been doing freelance work and kind of trying to play around a little bit. My girlfriend's a screenwriter, so we've had a couple projects that we've been working on as well, but I think I think I'm I'm more suited for full-time work than I am freelance. And maybe it's because this other project takes up so much time, but I find the constant kind of hustle of freelance work to be um, I like to kind of just sit down and work and do it, which feels like a little bit more like maybe I need or want a day job, which feels strange to say out loud.
Yeah, I mean, it's a delicate balance, and hustling it's tough. I mean,
Yeah.
as an entrepreneur, you got to get out there and find a way to make money.
Yeah. It's more than an hour a day.
Money is just coming in when you have a job.
Yep.
Some of that has to do with how happy you are with that job, but you could always
Yeah.
leave and find another one. Um, would this be a thing you would do full time if it could get crazy?
Yeah, I think so. I like the idea of, you know, putting more time into this is fun and enjoyable for me. And so there's a certain amount of it that is entertainment. Like I know that there's that's just kind of some of the value that people are getting on the other side. And so if I was doing more kind of output or videos or talking to people, but more if I had a podcast of interviewing shareholders or or there's different ways that I could kind of engage and do more with it. And if it was something that it was supporting me, full time, I think I would definitely kind of like lean in that direction. um, I also kind of like that it's not a um, financial requirement, because it kind of creates, I think, a little bit more opportunity for real friendship between people and for me and the shareholders, because I'm not relying on them as my sort of employers or as my paid audience. I'm not trying to monetize them beyond selling them shares. So I like that aspect. I like that it's in a little bit more of a playful space as opposed to a real pure, work entrepreneur space. There's I don't know, just like person the kind of like person to person connection feels a little bit better that way.
I think you might have to start doing that content or outreach or advertising to get that might be the first step to get the people to come in more. But it's yeah, I think if people randomly see this, I think there's so many people who drop money, whatever it is, 5, 10, 15 bucks into something to be like, hey, let me see what this is about, because that money kind of goes a long way, right? If you're talking about an entertainment value for the dollars that you're spending is pretty good.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something too. Like, there's a pressure on me to put things up for vote, and sometimes, especially as a 44-year-old, like, I'm not making the same big life decisions I was making, 12, 13 years ago. So that's probably the biggest pressure that I feel about this whole project, is kind of thinking, what are these votes to have people kind of direct me on? Because normally I like to say that my rule of thumb is anything I would ask friends for advice for is a shareholder question. But especially during the pandemic, it's not like we weren't no one was making very many choices, right? So that became a lot harder. And I don't want to bore people with the super small decisions. And so it's always trying to find that balance of like how frequent, how big the decisions have to be to kind of still be fun and engaging and meaningful to me.
I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but what percentage of decisions made would you say were right for you, like decisions you would have made on your own?
That's a good question. There's only been a couple that I've really disagreed with. And usually I've come around to kind of believing they were right. Honestly, like, I think that the votes tend to go yes more than no. There's a multiple choice version that we've added recently, but it used to be all the votes were yes or no. So I would propose something and it was pass fail. And the shareholders were generally very lenient in letting me kind of try anything. So there's probably more yeses that I haven't fully accomplished than there are nos that I regret. So I kind of need some more like taskmaster sort of harsh shareholders to come in and sort of limit some of my options to a certain extent. But
You, do you get suggestions? Because you said it has to be something that you introduce, like, you're not going to, go kill yourself, but do you get a lot of suggestions on what you should be voting on?
I get some. This thing I'm working on with these other two shareholders to potentially move to the blockchain was something that I wasn't considering on my own, but I was like, oh, that's a good shareholder question. So I'm super open to that. I kind of love when shareholders bring something to my attention that way. I should probably have more of a formal process for inviting those questions, because I think it, if somebody else is struggling with something, there's probably some version of it that I'm struggling with too, and this and I think that's been one of the most interesting things about this is putting up a question and kind of getting everybody's input and their version of what they think about it, and their experiences based on it. There was a pretty kind of silly question that came up of, do I believe in ghosts? Because I had an experience where I thought I saw something when I was staying at this like very old bed and breakfast in Mobile, Alabama, and I was like, I don't really believe in ghosts. So was that? I don't think it was one. And some friends actually that I was telling the story to were like, well, that's a shareholder vote. So I went and I described the whole thing, and it ended up passing. So the shareholder said, yes, you believe in ghosts based on this experience. So now I believe in ghosts, which is, that's a hard, I have to like really like remind, like, oh yeah, I believe in ghosts. I believe in ghosts. But it brought up this thing where suddenly everyone was responding with their own ghost stories. And that was like, and then another kind of community forming thing where it's like, because I brought this up, that opens up the idea that now everyone can talk about this thing. Similar with the vasectomy vote years and years ago, it was like an opportunity for a lot of people to talk about what they considered about it, their own experiences, whether or not they had done it. So it does spark a lot of really good and interesting conversations.
Where is what's the most interesting thing that's happened to you, would you say, since
I
since this,
Yeah,
related to this?
I think I think there's two versions of that. One is like the small changes that happen, like when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I do is I check my stock price, which is pretty weird. And so like when it's up, I feel a little better, and I'm a little more motivated. When it's down, I'm like, oh, what happened? That sucks. And so that has had like a pretty real but strange emotional impact at a really low level, on me over time. I think probably the the times that I've really, really needed the shareholders, whether that's been times that I used kind of sold shares for my own kind of financial support or asked them to help in finding a job or a place to live, that those have been probably the most powerful experiences where I'm like, oh, like these people, this collection of people care, like, and they care in a way that feels very personal and real and not abstract. And so sometimes like, yeah, like I get like, you know, pretty touched by that aspect of that relationship, which is
I think you
been
have. I
pretty
mean,
good.
obviously, if you're not just a shareholder, a sharer too, you have to care because otherwise,
Yeah,
why are you even doing it?
right. Because again, the share price hasn't moved that much. You're probably not getting rich doing this. So, like, if you don't care, then why are you participating? So, ideally, someone who sees something like this or comes across this says, it's they're curious enough to maybe buy a couple shares, and then as the emails kind of like let them know who I am and they start doing some exploration, they get a little bit more invested. And the most useful thing is when I put up those shareholder votes is just when there's a really good conversation back and forth, or people really like explaining like their point of view that to me seems, it's things I never would have considered based on experiences I've never had. You get a really different view of a scenario than you would if you're just trying to make that decision on your own.
Yeah, and just the collaborative nature of it is, I think it makes it probably better, more educated.
I think we all do it to a certain extent, like we ask our friends for advice, but the formality of having to write it up as a proposal, like that alone is a huge I've had a lot of things where as I start to write it up, I decide, oh, this isn't even a question. Like just the process of writing, trying to like explain both sides, pros and cons kind of thing. You're like, oh, well, this is very clear that either I should or shouldn't do this. So that's something that I think people can kind of steal from this idea. If you just write up a formal one-page proposal of some idea you're struggling with, you're going to have a lot of the answers right there. And then I don't think people should necessarily measure input based on, you know, how many shares people have, but then take that proposal and either talk it through with some other people or share it with them and get feedback. And I think you'll start to get those other viewpoints, which can really kind of like flesh out, you know, where the right answer is.
Has it made you make decisions easier, do you think?
It definitely is easier on the other end because there's that finality of, okay, the decision has been made, you know, and it's like I don't have to think about that anymore. I'm free of that worry. So, you know, with something like you know, the vasectomy, for example, it's like I don't even think about it anymore because the shareholders decided that. I don't have to. It ends the worrying about a decision in a really final way, which is kind of nice.
And in a way, you can't get it now. I mean, you could do whatever you want, but that would really be a
Right.
knock against the people who have shareholders.
Because it was so few shareholders at that time and it was so long ago, I have thought about bringing that one back and putting it up for vote again. So that might be something that we see in 2022 again. Because I'm still at the point where I'm like, I love kids, but I don't think I want any of my own.
Yeah, it's late in life. I'm probably the same way. It's a tough call, but if you let people make the decision for you, that obviously that makes it easier. Um, you mentioned I asked you about whether or not you thought someone would copy this. Do you ever think about you bringing someone in because you already know how this works and saying, "Hey, we can do this for you"?
Yeah, I did a version of that actually when I started a company, and I was very busy with that for a couple years, and it really just dropped the amount of engagement, time, and energy, and even number of votes I had. So I actually loaned this whole thing. I let someone else come in and ask my shareholders life questions. So it was this like young kid I knew in tech when I was in Portland, and so he actually used it to ask a number of questions, which is a pretty fun little experiment. Um, Now, as far as someone else adopting the whole thing, the kind of the code base and like the way this works is maybe not scalable in that way. Like we've kind of been, you know, slowly building it for a very specific purpose over time. So I'm not sure that would it'd be difficult to just do a direct copy of it. Um, I'm definitely would encourage anyone to experiment or try it. And I think there's enough tools out there now that you could do a lot of things without any coding experience. You know, you could create forms and spreadsheets and kind of do it without having to, you know, code something together. And I've talked to people about that, and I'm always like, you know, the hard part is not selling the shares and doing the finance stuff. The hard part is the interacting with the people and actually being open and honest enough about the decisions that you're going to make.
Yeah, that makes sense. You know about markets now. Do you dabble in the real markets?
Yeah, I dabble in pretty much everything. I I I love it. I love fractional ownership. I love stock prices. I dabble in crypto. The new trend of all the fractional ownership of collectibles, I think, is super interesting, and I've bought into a bunch of that stuff. Yeah, I mean, if it's, I'll experiment with pretty much anything, especially as a lot of these newer platforms allow you to do pretty low, you know, dollar amount kind of investments.
What are you most excited about with your collectible that you have a fractional piece of?
I actually I sold a bunch because I'm gonna kind of restart that with some shareholder control. But I let's see, what was I most excited about? There was the first thing I bought, I think, was like some shares of a Mickey Mantle baseball card that was pretty fun, because it actually like was one of the first ones to trade, and so I actually saw the price move because a lot of these you just kind of buy and hold for a while, and then you don't, and the markets are just now kind of starting on a lot of this stuff. Um, there's this site called Masterworks.io that lets you buy into like fractional ownership of super high end fancy painting. So like bought into an Andy Warhol, which is, just like, again, it's like as a kid, I was always like a huge fan. That was like my first, art crush was Andy Warhol. So I think collectibles are a fun way to kind of like, especially getting in from the finance level. It's like an adult way to engage with what you loved as a kid, whether it's, comic books or art or,
Yeah, at
whatever kind of thing.
a low entry cost. So
Yeah, exactly.
low risk, maybe high reward.
Yep. I've dabbled a bit with like NFTs, but I'm just, I think because of my project, I'm kind of more interested in the kind of token space and people doing things like that. There's a lot of people trying to figure out how to organize collectively online right now, and I find that super fascinating as something I've been doing for a long time.
Yeah, Discord and Slack is really,
Yeah.
those are
Yep.
the big communities. But it kind of gets overwhelming, doesn't it? If
Oh,
you
it
get
totally does. Like,
too many people in there.
and too many instances too, like in exploring the crypto space, you end up with like 30 something discords, and it's like, how do you be a member of that many communities? You kind of have to pick where to put your attention, but there's so many interesting things going on that I kind of want to like keep up with all of it. So yeah, you sort of have to decide which ones you want to step into. And for me, that sort of influences how often I want to, like, again, send out an email or do a vote, or how much do I want to, like, how active do I want to be versus be relatively passive as an experience for my shareholders. I think I go a little too passive. I should probably up it a little bit, but
Oh,
I do that as a form of generosity, not as a form of laziness.
man, goals for 22. Well, check out mike-merrill.com, and then from there you can click to become a shareholder at kmikeym.com. Looking forward to the TED Talk. I think it's going to be a pretty good event for you, and hopefully get some more attention to this, which I think is it's fascinating. So we look forward to seeing it and hearing where this takes us in 2022. And I'm going to take advantage of the shares that I own. We're going to let you out of here with the same question we let everyone go with. You can spend a day with anyone in the world. They have to be alive, and you can't be related to them. Who would you pick, and what would you guys do?
Man, I've always been jealous of the whoever it is that wins the Warren Buffett lunch that he does for charity. So if I could do that for free and not have to bid on that, I think spending a day, in my mind, he's sort of the epitome of capitalism, right? Like he feels like he does it out of a pure love of it, even though he's also very good at it and made a lot of money with it. So yeah, I think that's the first thought that comes to mind.
Yeah, that's not a bad pick. I don't know if we've had him selected. We try and do outreach. We've done a little bit of outreach for some of our guests. I think if you have enough money or fame or notoriety, you can make any of this happen. So who knows? I mean,
I feel like you kind of have to pick somebody older though, because like they're the ones that you're going to lose the chance on too. It's like, young people, I can maybe go try to meet them. I got more time.
yeah, you got some chances here. Well, who knows? You might be able to do it. Just reach out to him and say, "Hey, look what I did. What do you think?" We'll see what happens. We got one more episode of the Wolff Den on Monday. That's the last episode of the year. So don't forget to tune in. Everyone have a great night. Have a great weekend. Really appreciate your time here today, and I'll see you in the poker game soon.
See ya. Thanks so much.